Hello and welcome. It's a very, very special program because we're all worried about the Indian economy. There's some positives, there's some negatives. But if there's one person who can really analyze it through experience and through, Arvind, they say kidney as well, is Arvind Subramanian. We've done programs before when he was Chief Economic Advisor. Now he's teaching at Harvard University. And he's done a lot of amazing work on the Indian economy, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the overall summary is India's Great Slowdown. In the preparation for this, I must also thank one of your researchers for many years, Navneeraj. He's been a great help, who really helped simplify and make us understand exactly what's going on. Wonderful. We kind of divide this program into three parts. First will be, it's like a patient and a doctor. Arvind is a doctor. First he looks at what are the symptoms. How bad is the Indian economy? What are the signs and symptoms of things going right and wrong? Secondly, okay, given the symptoms, what is his diagnosis of the problem? Why is it happening? What is the disease, or what are the positives and what are the negatives? And finally, as a doctor, what remedies does he prescribe? Arvind, there's a lot of work gone into this. For once you've worked in your life. And how long is this? You've been working for the last 2-3 days? Or?
Yeah. Firstly, it's co-authored with a colleague of mine who was the IMF's representative, Josh Feldman.
Yes,
so he's my chief economic advisor. So
right.
Together we worked on this for 3-4 months now.
3-4 months on this one paper, and it's causing quite an impact. But I think it's more, when I read it, I feel I do follow the Indian economy quite closely, but I learned a lot from this. Let's start with the most simple, straightforward fact. Most of us know this, but just put it in stark terms. Just have a look at this. Is the Indian economy heading for ICU? And just look at the figures here. The figures suggest that the growth rate is plummeting in India. Plummeting meaning it was 8% a short while ago, and now it's at 4.5% in the most recent quarter. These are government sources. So Arvind, when it was 7-8%, you wrote that very strong paper with a lot of analysis of why our data is not too good and is probably 2.5% higher. So 8 would have been 5.5. So 4 is bad enough, even if it's correctly 4, but it could be even less than that?
Well, you see, as you know, the GDP numbers are, becoming, not as informative as they used to be. Right. I mean, there are difficulties with those numbers.
Is it now around the world recognized now that there are some problems with India? Because it never used to be.
Yeah, I think it's now globally accepted that I think right. Our GDP numbers need some looking at carefully. So the answer to your question is 4.5. You see, I can't be precise, but as we go through the indicators that we're going to go through now, right. To look at the more detailed macro indicators, right. You get the impression that in fact maybe even 4.5 is paints a picture, rosier picture than the underlying reality.
That is shocking, because I would be feeling awful about the country if it's growing at 4.5%. I mean, it's back to my old school Raj Krishna days. Yeah. And it could still be really 3%? That is just horrifying. Yeah,
I can't give a number, but as we go through the indicators, we'll see that, in fact, it is something, what we're going through, as you said, is the Great Slowdown. It's something that probably we haven't seen for a very long time, 20, 30 years. The real economy is in, it's not just any ordinary slowdown.
I really feel that's the point that you highlight in this paper, and I don't think everybody's understood the magnitude of the problem. I knew we're in bad shape, but till I read your paper, I felt that was a problem. And look at some of the indicators that make you even question whether 4.5 is correct. 4.5 is depressingly low. But if it's lower than that, and some of these indicators suggest that, just look at this. If you look at imports, how bad is the Indian economy? Imports are almost as bad as 30 years ago. As you were saying, that we haven't seen such bad indicators for the last 3 decades. So in the current growth, imports are down 6%. And capital goods industry, really important, it's almost a proxy for investment, down 10%. Now, when you've got -6 and -10, you have to go back 30 years to find things similar. Look at that. Imports, okay, minus 16%, little more. Capital good industry, -9, very comparable. And what was the growth rate 30 years ago? 1.1 with those kind of figures. So when we look at the figures today, -6 and -10, what is the GDP growth? Is it really 4.5? Based on the comparison, you'd have to question it.
See, I think, you know, many, not just, there's also export figures,
Right.
consumer goods figures, tax revenue
Right.
figures.
Yeah.
In fact, in the paper, what we do is that we take all these indicators and then say, let's look at, you know, a previous era of a slowdown, which was 2000, 2002.
Yes.
Yeah. There, what you find is that even though the GDP growth around then was 4.5, all these indicators were actually in positive territory.
Yeah.
It's only you have to go back to 91 when growth was, you know, close to 1%.
I want you to repeat that.
Yeah.
In the terrible slowdown of 2001, 2002, these two indicators were actually
And
marginally
others.
positive.
Yeah, and others.
And others were
yeah.
marginally positive, and you still had 4.5% with
Yeah.
positive. Now it's negative, and you have to go back 30 years to find that.
Yeah.
That is a real shocker.
Yeah.
And that really does make you question whether with these kind of figures you can have 4.5. But anyway, we'll get, as you say, there are more figures you point out to. Let's have a look at the Indian economy, the Great Slowdown, more indicators of that. In fact, if you look at falling consumer good production growth rate, consumer goods, it's not just capital goods, consumer good production growth rate is falling. Look at that. From 5% just 2 years ago to 1% now. 1% in consumer goods production is worrying, isn't it? That kind of growth rate?
So I think one way of thinking about this is that if you look at all these indicators, Prannoy, they're either in negative growth territory or they're barely positive growth territory, right? And so, you know, what it says is that this is not any slowdown. That's why it's India's great slowdown.
It's not just another temporary blip.
And, you know, see, the comparison with 91, 92, we have to be careful because, you know, we don't have a macroeconomic crisis at all. In fact, one of the achievements of the government has been to stabilize the macroeconomy. You know, inflation has come down, our reserves are very healthy, we have no external debt problem, so we're not going to have a currency crisis. Inflation is relatively low. In 91, we had this BOP crisis, major disruptive event. So that's not the comparison. The comparison is with what happened to the real sector of the economy, you know, growth, investment, exports, imports.
Yeah, which matters for jobs,
which matters for jobs,
everybody's lives.
Which matters for, you know, it also matters for how much revenue the government has to spend on social programs. So
exactly.
The interesting thing is that, and maybe we can talk about that later, what is, you know, the way this slowdown is going to manifest itself or is manifesting itself is not in terms of, you know, exchange rate collapse or inflation going up. It's
one thing we have done over the last 30 years is this huge foreign exchange reserves.
Exactly.
So we don't have to go rushing to IMF and ask for money.
And we're not even close to, you know, very robust macroeconomy. But on the real sector, you know, economy slowing, jobs, you know, people's incomes, people's wages, and of course, government revenues and what it does to social spending programs.
See, okay, these are all index of industrial production and various other forms of symptoms. But one of the symptoms you point to, which actually rings very close to everybody's understanding, is how much electricity is being generated. If that's up, it's a good sign. If everything's down and that's up, something's wrong. But look at what electricity generation growth is happening in India. It is really, really serious. It's a sign of a major crisis, the Great Slowdown. Electricity, lowest growth in 30 years. 30 years. Look at that. Of course, it goes up and down over different cycles. But look at the two earlier terrible low points. 2001, 3%, 2008, 9, 10, again after the great financial crash, 2.5, and now electricity generation has grown by 1.8. Yep. That really makes you feel that serious.
You know that, there's a history to, this is of course one amongst many indicators, and it is an important indicator. You know that the Chinese Prime Minister Li Keqiang, he did an index. He said he also had doubts about Chinese numbers on growth rates. So he said let's measure it some other way. And in that electricity is a very crucial component of that. Yeah. And so this this only reinforces all the other indicators that we've seen, which suggest that something serious is happening in the economy.
Yes, imports down,
exports
consumer
down,
goods down, exports down,
capital goods down, consumer goods down, tax revenues down.
Tax revenues, okay, let's just have a look at tax revenues. Well, let's quickly look at exports, what you mentioned, and then come to tax revenues, because again, historically, exports show whether your country is really booming, whether there is some external factors, the global, the lack of the global trade, it's got a shrinking, but still, a growth rate of 9% 2 years ago, which was not great, by the way, 9% exports is not great, down to -1 now, and this is non-oil. Both imports and exports are non-oil, to be comparable. Yeah. So why is this happening, -1%? Again, part of the same problem or combination?
No, I think that on the export side, part of it is related to global factors. There is, of course, the global economy is not doing as well as it used to, but there's also the question of whether there are domestic factors at work. For example, the ease of doing business, the exchange rate has been slightly strong for some period of time, and the competitiveness of the Indian economy, the competitiveness of our manufacturing, and also our services exports. They did very well earlier. Now they're doing just modestly well.
Oh, that's
so all of these, I think, they all kind of, the pattern is the same with all these indicators.
It's a pattern, and as you were saying earlier, all these are real factors that affect jobs and people's lives. Even exports too.
Yeah, of course.
Exporters are going bust, and -1%.
Yeah, just to give you a benchmark, so in the 1990s, between 92, a 10-year period when the economy did quite well, our exports were growing in double digit. Similarly, in the 2000s, when we were doing very well, exports were growing double digits, and now it's
-1 and 9. We were, and this kind of the trend downwards is the big worry. Yeah. Now, all this affects not only jobs, as you said, it also affects how much revenues the government gets. If the economy is doing well, it has a huge impact on revenues. Let's have a look at how much direct taxes. There's a big squeeze currently on government. And you, as finance ministry, and I was there many years before you were born, feel sorry for a finance minister who, look at this, direct tax. We're not even talking about GST here. Direct tax revenues are falling. They were growing at 16%. These are nominal, of course.
No, this is adjusted for inflation.
Oh, yes, you adjusted for inflation. So it would have been maybe 19, so adjusted by about 3-4%, maybe 16, 10, and now 0% growth.
Yeah. So
that
essentially,
is terrible.
So essentially, both direct taxes and the GST, we're collecting for the first 8-9 months for which data are available, we're about 3.5 to 3.6%, which in inflation adjusted is virtually 0%. Right. So essentially, the government is squeezed for resources.
Right. And when you say direct taxes, you mean personal tax and corporate tax?
Yeah. So this direct taxes are personal income tax and corporate taxes. The main ones. And GST is very similar, the GST. Aggregate GST for the country as a whole.
I mean, it really makes a finance minister
task very difficult.
You have some sympathy for somebody who's got no growth in revenues, no real growth in revenues.
I think that the only point to make, one important point to emphasize is that there's a lot of talk about, say, the GST is not performing well. They look at the numbers and say, and today we wrote a piece saying that I think that's actually being very harsh on the GST. I think actually the GST revenue performance has been quite good. the revenues have come down not because the GST is doing badly, it's because the economy is
doing badly. I mean, you can tell by direct taxes.
Exactly.
So it's almost the same, in fact, maybe doing marginally better than direct tax.
Exactly.
Marginally,
So
instead of 0%, 1%.
Exactly. So I think that we should not be harsh on the GST because the GST itself has done...
It's a reflection.
Yeah, it's a reflection of the economy.
Right. So those are symptoms which I find I didn't realize how serious it was. Diagnosis now. What is the cause? As a doctor, you've given 3 or 4 kind of reasons for this slowdown. Let's have a look at some of the reasons that could be causing this great Indian slowdown. Just have a look at this. The reasons for the slowdown is basically a breakdown of our financial system. And there have been so many other diagnoses, but this one is the key one that you focused on. And it kind of relates long-term and short-term problems.
So obviously, we simplified a little bit that, what is, I think, the reason we are where we are today is because of a combination of long-term factors and short-term factors. Right. But they're both connected by the financial system, what we're going to call the twin, first the twin balance sheet
the
problem.
Famous twin balance sheet.
One, and then a second wave of the twin balance sheet. But some of the, remember the long-term factors also include the fact that our exports have, completely compared to the previous decade, they've slowed down remarkably, as you saw. So that's one long-term factor. Right. Investment also is down, but investment is critically related to this twin balance sheet challenge. We're going to come to that.
One of the things I just wanted to ask you, we talked about exports, but we've been so lucky with imports in oil. I think in about 2014-15, oil prices came down by half. You'd think India was just an oil importer, I mean, largely. When oil prices come from $110 per barrel to 60 or 65, you think we'd boom.
See, but it's a good point, Prannoy, but what we say in the paper is that, these structural factors, when exports and investment kind of collapsed quite a bit, then why did the economy sink even further? And the answer is that oil prices actually gave us a boost. It gave a boost to revenues, gave a boost to consumption. So it propped up, shored it up, and prevented it from becoming much worse than it otherwise would have been.
That's very kind. It's like when you go to a doctor and he gives you an aspirin and you say, head is better, but it's not there. He said, it would have been so much worse if you hadn't had the medicine.
No, but that is true. The oil price gave us a bit of a cushion for
if you drop from 110 to 60 or 65, that's wonderful for a country like this.
The other thing is that, other thing to mention is that in terms of the short-term factors, several people have said, weak agricultural performance, which may be true as well, demonetization and GST.
But sorry, weak agricultural means it's not been a terrible monsoon every year. We're pretty lucky on that.
But prices, agricultural prices were down. So agricultural incomes were down. So that's a short-term factor.
Agricultural incomes were down,
Short-term factor.
Output not down, incomes down.
Exactly.
Which matters to the average farmer.
Exactly. And then, of course, everyone has spoken about the demonetization GST. That has also probably had a short-term impact as well. But what we argue in the paper is that these may be important, but the key short-term factor is a second wave of the twin balance sheet challenge.
So it's now 4 balance sheet problems.
We're going to come to that, hopefully. But essentially, to summarize, the first balance sheet was when the public sector banks led to the infrastructure companies, and there was over-exuberant lending. There was also some cronyism. A lot of bad lending went on, and that created the first wave, where then. And the way to understand the twin balance sheet crisis is that, the infrastructure sector had too much debt, right? And this was actually first pointed out by Ashish Gupta of Credit Suisse. He did that famous house of debt.
He showed the...
the first, in fact, the regulators and the government were all behind. So
they were just hiding the non-performing assets, and he said it's way higher.
The debt was way high for the corporates.
Let's have a look at your what your paper says about the double twin balance sheet, or twin, or 4 balance sheet problem. It's linked to the breakdown in the financial system. Now, earlier, the twin balance sheet problem or the crisis was banks and infrastructure companies, corporates of the infrastructure area, right? Mainly. Everybody was affected, but banks were giving it to infrastructure and they were not being able to pay it back.
Because remember, growth slowed down considerably.
Yes,
these
yes.
loans were made in the boom period, and then when the growth slowed down, so many of these investments went sour.
All right. So bank loans to infrastructure, corporates and others that could not be repaid. They could not repay them. So they both had, the infrastructure company balance sheet affected the bank's balance sheet.
Because they couldn't repay the banks.
They couldn't repay the banks.
Yeah.
Now, what's happening now is the 4 balance sheet crisis. The first twins and another twin. This is NBFCs. Now, for those who are not quite familiar with these
can I just explain NBFCs?
Yes, please.
So NBFCs are essentially called non-bank financial companies. They do, on the lending side, they do lending like the banks, but they don't take money from depositors. Right. So that's why, so in a sense, they are less sacred in some ways, because with the banks, depositor money is involved. You want to be ultra sure that everything is safe. Right. NBFCs take a bit more risk because they don't borrow from depositors, but they do the same lending that banks do. Right. Yeah. So in this second wave,
So NBFCs gave a lot of money to real estate companies, and real estate has had a real hit. So they've not been able to pay back. NVCs, we've seen a major NBC. ILFS.
No, ILFS is not ILFS is an NBFC, but ILFS is. Let's just come to ILFS. See,
okay, so just generally NBFCs, they are all in the doldrums right now, and ILFS is a special problem. But they're just one kind of NBFC. But generally NBFCs, and for the same reason, more or less.
Yeah. So just to summarize, the first twin balance sheet was public sector banks lending to infrastructure.
Infrastructure
companies.
Meaning roads, bridges.
No, the companies like the companies that build the roads, the airports, the bridges, and so on. Right.
Correct, yeah.
In this second wave, what happened? And remember, it's important to emphasize also is that this second wave, essentially, credit picked up after demonetization. That's important to note. Right. From about March, June of 2017, for about 4 to 6 quarters, these non-bank financial companies and also the banks lent a lot, and a lot of it went to the real estate sector. So now when the real estate sector is not done well, the real estate companies which do real estate have taken a hit, and the NBFCs who lent to them have taken a hit.
So this was
that's why the 4 balance sheets now.
Yep, very clearly explained and really important. But it was all that because of high expectations, people expected the economy to do well, infrastructure to do well, and just look at the housing sector. What has happened to it? It has really belied all expectations. It's failed all our expectations, I should say. So the collapse in the real estate sector, the real estate bubble. Have a look at this. That housing sales are 2 lakh crores a year. This is the housing sector, 2 lakh crores a year.
This is housing, top 8 cities.
Top 8 cities, yes. Top 8 cities, 2 lakh crores a year. And look at the amount of unsold houses, 8 lakh crores a year. And it's been this kind of for the last 3 or 4 years. So we are just about building enough to, we are building about 2 lakh crores a year, because that 8 lakh crores unsold remains every year. This is huge.
So the way to understand, see, I call this, we call this in the paper a non-bubble bubble. And I'll explain why that is the case. You see, this is kind of a little bit the counterpart of what happened, in the global, financial crisis in the United States and in some other countries. So when all this lending goes to the real estate sector, what normally happens is that prices go up, houses get built, and there's a very buoyant market. In India, what was different was all this money that was going. Remember, lending to real estate was growing at 20% per year. 20% per year.
Lending to real estate growing at 20% a year.
Both the banks and the non-NBFCs. And then but it was mostly or largely financing the buildup of unsold inventory. So essentially, you're not lending to build, but you're lending to just maintain the inventory.
My gosh.
And then, so how does this bubble kind of burst, as it were? Maybe if you show the next graphic.
If we have a look at the next one, there's a big a collapse in lending.
Commercial credit,
In commercial credit, right across the board, of which housing is a major important part. So collapse in commercial credit. And part of it is impact of ILS bubble crisis. We'll come to that. But part of the collapse in commercial credit, housing loans have also plummeted. Just look at commercial credit, how it's dropped from 22 lakh crores. That's a lot of money. What is it now? 1 lakh crore.
Yeah.
I mean, to drop by one.
This is like savage.
Savage, yes.
It's a savage credit crunch. But this is where I want to spend 2 minutes explaining this.
Yes, yes, yes.
See, whenever something like this happens, it's like a major financial sector crunch, episode. It happens because of 2 reasons. There's a trigger, and there are some fundamentals which are unsustainable.
Right.
So the trigger for this was ILFS, going into default in August 2018.
Right.
Now, why was it a major trigger? It was a seismic event. It was a seismic event for 2 reasons, at least 2 reasons. One, how did this appear out of nowhere? 90,000 crore ILFS company. The regulators, no one sounded a warning about it. No one knew about it. It became, so 90,000 crores, and it turned out to be a huge behemoth. But over and above that, people said, look, if this can happen, what else is wrong in the financial system?
All the other NBFCs and other sectors.
And then they looked at the real estate sector. So that was the trigger. The fundamental is that, essentially this lending was financing the buildup of housing. So it was not a profitable business, right? It was a bit like a Ponzi scheme, what we call evergreening, right? You just give money to keep that same level of thing. Then people said this is unsustainable. And it's a combination of the trigger plus these fundamental unsustainable lending that then the crunch happens. Because then banks, everyone says, what happened was that...
And these things suddenly happen.
Yeah, they say, so the people who were funding the NBFCs, some were banks, some were mutual funds, we don't have to go into, they suddenly withdrew, and then everyone...
all the NBFCs got badly affected.
And then, so the banks and the NBFCs suddenly stopped lending altogether because they said, it's a very risky business.
It's a risky business. It was like
And this is the credit crunch that now has, really severe in its intensity, which has caused the growth to come down so sharply.
From 22 to 1. I'm going to ask you a ridiculous question. Is this ILFS almost like the Lehman crisis? That are you seeing something really serious happening in this 22 to 1?
No, this is what's impacting the economy, because you remember credit is the grease that runs the economy. If you don't have credit, everything slows down, and we're seeing manifestations of this everywhere. But I think the fact of ILFS plus these NBFCs, because now is where the 4 balance sheets really are operative, right? Banks are still, although the NPAs of the banks have come down, they're still quite high. Now we have NBFCs also.
NPAs, we should say, are non-performing, have bad loans, bad debts.
Basically bad loans. And now the NBFCs are there. And then, the corporates and the real estate sector are, that's the source of the problem, as it were. But what is, I think, why I think the outlook is a bit somber is when we come to the next chart, which is that the fact of the slow growth itself and the credit crunch is itself going to aggravate the problem.
That's what I was going to ask you. It's pretty bleak up to now. Is it going to get worse? Let's have a look at what Arvind Subramanian's written about looking a little ahead and what are the fundamental underlying problems that's causing this and could be a worry for the future. Is the crisis going to get worse or not, or is it just temporary? Companies are actually now paying more in bank interest than their expected earnings. That's a huge statement, and it really is a worrying statement. If every year you're paying more out on servicing your loans, just the interest, than what you're earning in profits, it's a big worry. Look at company finances, according to this paper. Interest rate on loans currently is 10.5% to companies. And look at what their expected earnings are. Likely earnings 6.1%. So look at that gap. That means there's a gap, a shortfall annually of 4.4%. Now tell us how you get these figures.
So just to explain this a little bit, so remember, companies borrow, they make profits, and they repay their interest and the loans on that, right? A kind of proxy, see, for any one company, you want to proxy it by their profits. But for the corporate sector as a whole, generally what we say is that earnings are likely to grow on average with nominal GDP growth. So that's a kind of indicator of how earnings and profits are likely to go. So that is your what you get, and then you have to repay what you borrowed, and for the corporate sector as a whole, it's about 10.5%. See, in boom periods like in the 2000s and 1990s, it was completely the opposite. Nominal GDP growth was like 15, 20%,
right.
and interest rates were again like 13, 14%. So the difference was kind of +5, +6, +7. Now it's -4, -5, -6. So the whole
this is really
and this is going to add to the stress on the corporates, and therefore that's why we have to have this in mind when we assess the outlook going forward, because what this suggests is that things probably are going to get worse before they get better.
Yeah. Things are going to get worse before they get better.
And I think that's important to understand, because in some way we have to break this cycle of earnings growth and nominal GDP growth being much lower than the cost of borrowing. We can come to that later, but this is also going to affect the government, because the government is going to be squeezed as well. So that's
the government is facing a similar squeeze. The tax revenues are down to 0.
Yeah, exactly.
And
real growth,
they're paying interest rates. Yeah,
exactly. So this squeeze on the private sector and the government sector is going to add to the current uncertainty and somber mood, and that's why I think we need a real package of actions, both what shouldn't be done and what should be done, in order to break the cycle very quickly.
Otherwise, if we don't do all, is this like heading for a debt trap? Because if you're going a shortfall of 4% a year, that's not good news. Yeah,
so I think if you look at, in fact, Ashish Gupta's latest numbers for a measure of corporate stress, it actually jumped in the latest quarter. Quite substantially.
Corporate stress.
It's basically measured by, what is the debt with companies that find it difficult to repay their interest?
Right.
He has a very nice measure on that, and it jumped from about 42% to 45% in the most recent period. And it reflects exactly this. So if this continues, that corporate stress is going to go up, and that's why we need to break the cycle, and that's why the doctor now needs to turn to.
Now we've done the diagnosis of the problem we saw. Now, what are the remedies, and how are you going to treat the economy?
Yeah.
Let's have a look one by one at some of the things. First, what you should not do.
Yeah.
Because given your diagnosis, certain things, if you treat, would exacerbate the problem. Yeah. So what not to do first in the solutions for the crisis? Budget deficit currently does not reflect the true picture, because it's got hidden expenditures. So stop those. What do you mean? What do you mean by that? Hidden expenditures.
Yeah. So it's something that the Comptroller and Auditor General pointed out. Our headline deficits have been coming down, but some major expenditures, like for the subsidies for Food Corporation of India, some of the infrastructure spending, like for National Highway Authority, it's not reflected in the budget. It's off balance sheet, right?
Off budget, actually.
Off budget. In this case, it's off budget. Yeah. Therefore, the true deficit, according to even the Comptroller Auditor General, is quite a bit higher than that.
So the declared budget deficit is around what? Between 3 and 3.5?
So if you consolidate center and states...
Okay. Just take center alone for the time being?
Yeah, center, I think the headline...
It's about 3.5%.
Yeah, something like
3.5%. And if you included these hidden factors off balance sheet...
It's another 2 percentage points of GDP.
5.5.
5.5% of GDP, yeah.
And sorry, with the states?
States, I think the number, one number, and this is kind of also some of the private sector numbers, it's between 8.5% and 9% of GDP. And this year it's likely to get, given the new revenue numbers, it's probably going to deteriorate much more.
So when we've been so proud of a central government budget deficit coming down 3.5%, but actually it's 5.5. That's awful.
Yeah, so
we're just putting more and more stuff in off balance sheet, off budget.
Yeah. So I think that
has to stop.
Yeah. So I think there are two lessons in this actually. One is that I think just to follow the CNAG and get the accounting to be much cleaner.
And what you're saying here is that don't think your budget deficit very low and just increase budget deficit and boost. That's the second point.
The second implication is that we actually probably don't have any space at all.
If you're at 5.5, you can't say increase budget deficit to boost the economy.
And remember, if you look at the combined, and you don't want to get into double-digit deficits for the center and the state governments, which happened, just after the global financial crisis, and then it happened in the 80s and so on. So we don't, because that makes our debt fiscal situation much more tricky and fragile.
Very important point actually. 3.5, you had a little bit of room and you could say yes. And what you're saying, your second point you raise, is that do not try and boost the economy, do not raise government spending. Don't boost the economy by raising government. A lot of people are saying that's what you need to do.
Yeah. So exactly, this is basically, essentially, a better way to put this is to say, don't increase the deficit anymore because it's already very high.
Don't have room.
Yeah, we just don't have room.
And that's the third point you say, again, which everybody is saying, and you're saying, do not cut personal income tax rate because you're 5.5 budget deficit, not 3.5. So don't think that you've got room to play with.
Yeah, here there are 2 points at least, Prannoy. Yeah? One is the whole point about whether we have room for this or not, right? But the second point is that, look, there's a general concern that we have to boost consumption, which is a valid concern, right? But then you have to ask, if you cut the tax rates to boost consumption, who does this benefit? It benefits, because who pays the individual income tax? The top 4-5% of India. The bottom 90% are much poorer. Those are the people whose consumption you want to boost. So if you want to boost consumption and you have limited space, you have an allocation problem. Do you want to give it to the rich or the salaried middle class? But they're also very high up in the income distribution.
Compared to the relatively rich,
exactly. So I would say, therefore, if you have to boost consumption, a much more effective and just way of doing this would be to give something like, direct benefit transfers, universal basic income, or even expand programs like PM Kisan. Much more effective, much more equitable
and
way.
much more targeted.
Yeah,
That's
much more
very
targeted.
important point you raise about taxes just affect a relatively rich lot. And you also say, do not raise GST rates. Do not increase those. And your final point is, do not blame GST for all this. Now, explain those two.
See, I think that, look, there's a lot of pressure to increase GST rates coming from what's happening between the center and the states. States say, pay us our 14%. Center says we don't have, money is not there in the GST. So that's why the pressures come to increase GST rates. So, but I think that the reason not to increase GST rates now is first, when an economy is kind of slowing down and in such a, you shouldn't raise taxes.
In any case,
correct? And second, it's very odd, right? If you on the one hand, you want to reduce income tax rates to boost consumption, and the other, you're raising GST rates which is going to actually affect
reduce consumption. And by the way, both contradictory as well as one is for the rich and one is for everybody.
Exactly, that's a very good point.
Does not make sense. Yeah.
So what I think we need to do is we need a wholesale re-evaluation of the GST rate structure, but once the economy has recovered. In a kind of slowdown is not the time to tinker with these things. Let the economy stabilize, and then we need a wholesale review. And then we should probably go much more to the structure that I suggested in my revenue neutral rate report. Just have 3 rates, and
GST.
And we should stop kind of tinkering.
I remember
with
we've always
rates.
said that, and everybody now says 3 rates, even 1 is fine, but this 6 rates where cashew nuts here, almond is here, and it just doesn't make it too complicated. But implementation has been a problem.
Yeah, but all that being said, I think it's
this is not the time.
It's not the time. The GST has been one of the fantastic achievements of this government, both politically, administratively, technologically, and now because revenues are down, people are saying, the GST was a bad idea. No, the GST revenues reflect the weak state of the economy. GST is doing quite well. We do need to revisit this, but now is not the time.
Actually, we should just stop here because most economists know what not to do. But you've gone one step further, which is really a very brave of you, what you should do. And you've got a list of things. Let's go through each one of them. What is the doctor order for the economy right now? Dr. Arvind Subramanian, what does he say? So what should be done? Number 1, and this is a crucial issue, although it's a bit academic, but there's more than just academia, fix India's data problem. We need to know whether we're growing at 10%, 8%, 6%, 4%, 1%. We need to know that.
No, but Prannoy, I'm going to push back. It's not an academic problem.
I'm going to say it's
not just an academic problem, because I think there are 2 huge advantages that come from fixing
getting the data right.
One is that it just, confidence and trust in government goes up, right?
That matters.
And that,
globally, that matters.
Globally, investors, you're confident that, this is, and then remember, that has an impact on animal spirits, etc. But I think the second reason is that how can you navigate an economy when you know some basic numbers? Remember, it's not just a GDP. In a paper, in an article that we wrote, you know, I can pose now 4, 5 basic questions that policymakers need to answer, for which the data are not reliable. So just take the budget, for example, right? You know, headline is 3.5, but
Actual
CAG says more. Which is it? Because if it's 3.5, we have room probably. If it's 5.5,
it does affect your actual policies, your remedies.
A second example on the loans. I mean, are our bad, you know, whatever the non-performing loans, the bad loans, are they under control, or have they got out of control because of the NBFC crisis?
And whether the data on that's being hidden, or you're right. It's not just academic.
And let me say one thing. You know, just this is a new sharp point about why it matters. Let me give you an example. You know, this whole debate about compensation of 14% to the states, right? It's come up, and people say, oh, it's so high. And the states are saying you have to pay. Prannoy, the thing is that when that 14% number was kind of devised, we had the sense that the economy was growing at kind of 7.5%, right? So you said, oh, 7.5%, inflation of about 4.5%, that gives you like 12, 13%. So compensation of 14% to the state is not unreasonable because your revenues were going to grow. But if actually, you know, GDP is growing, you know, at say, whatever, 4 or 3 or whatever it is, your compensation would have been very different. So it's not academic, it's actually very, very crucial for so many policy decisions.
I take my words back, because you are an academic. I had to have a little
dig it,
but it's a fact that you do need to know what you're doing to decide your policies.
See, it's like a you know, the economy is like a very complex car. You know, the speedometer, if it doesn't work, you don't know how much air pressure there is. You don't know if the fuel tank is full or not. I mean, it's not easy to navigate an economy in these circumstances. So it's not academic at all.
Okay, let's move on to other factors that should be fixed in the economy. Let's have a look. First, fix the financial system, and several points here. Number one, an independent assessment of bad loans. You really focus on that, because...
See, remember, just a bit of history. I think part of the reason why this problem has festered for so long, because I think collectively as a country, government, regulator, RBI, we've been in kind of denial about accepting the true state of the problem. You know, I think once we saw what the true state of the problem was, we mobilized policy action, and the government deserves a lot of credit for enacting the IBC, the bankruptcy code, under which some, you know, real progress has been made. Right? But today now, again, after this new bout of, you know, lending to the NBFCs, we similarly need to know, again, how much is the bad stuff? You know, unless you don't know
again,
that.
Is that again more of a symptom than an actual problem? Because part of the problem is a phone call. Inko bank loan de do, otherwise, you know, you lose your job. You know, that has to also change.
Right? See, that has to change, but that's a much deeper problem, right? That's a much. But for the moment, let's just come clean on what we know. So that, you know, we can take the requisite action.
Can see whether more phone calls are being made or less these days. Whatever
it is.
An indicator
of that.
Like many people say, elections cause black money, but actually, it's the money you can make after elections when you're in power that leads to investment in elections and black money. So unless that changes, similarly, unless the phone calls change, you will carry on getting bank loans. But here's an indicator of how many phone calls are being made.
But here, the other point to make, which is again in the current context I want to emphasize, is that people are saying now that, you know, the new problem is with the NBFCs, which made all these real estate loans. No, I don't think that goes far enough, because NBFCs are connected to the banks. It's the banks that also lend to the NBFCs. So in the new assessment, we also have to see what the true state of the banks themselves are.
So a point you just raised, and I'll put two of them together now. You mentioned improve the bankruptcy code. It's working reasonably well, but there are a lot of delays, and there are a few anomalies in it, and they've made some changes recently.
Very true.
So that's one. And the second point, which is related to the first two, is that create a bad bank for power and real estate. Now, bad bank, you mean?
Okay,
bank for bad loans.
Two bad banks. So essentially, the way a bad bank works is the government sets up an agency. it takes all the bad loans from off the books of the regular banks.
All the bad, non-performing loans, it takes into a separate bank.
Okay. And then it tries to extract maximum
best possible
value from that. Either, you change the management, then you find the best bidder to run the company through a transparent process. Or if
that's a different set of skills. So maybe a separate bank for that, they would have those sort of skills.
Yeah, exactly. See, but at the risk of getting too complicated, the IBC was meant to be, the bankruptcy code was meant to be also address this precise problem. Yeah. But the point we make now is that, say for the power sector, the IBC may not be the appropriate avenue for and let me try and explain it as simply as I can.
Right.
See, in the IBC, essentially, the way it should work is, you say you have a kind of transparent market type process for determining the true value, right? That's it. And then either you liquidate or you get change management and you extract the maximum value. You have to write off loans and so on. But the thing is that what if the true value, as it were, depends on other actions that the government has to take? So in the power sector, many private sector power plants were built, which are highly efficient, etc., but they're not working because for whatever reason.
Distribution, they're not being paid.
For all kinds of reasons. Yeah. But supposing you could get...
they're not getting coal.
Exactly, exactly, not getting coal.
Various reasons,
Supposing they could get the coal. Supposing tariffs could go up to reasonable levels. Supposing we could phase out the inefficient plants and use this. The value of these assets goes up. So where true value depends upon other government action that has to be taken. It has to be done through a government-led, specialized thing. And that's what a bad bank is.
Very good point. Let's have a look at your next point, and that is that you increase supervision of NBFCs. Now, they've been reasonable success until the big collapse now, but totally unsupervised, and they were not, that really was a mistake.
See, here, Prannoy, this is actually a much bigger point than just the NBFCs. If you were to look back on our financial system for the last 10 years, I mean, there have been a series of catastrophic neglects, as it were. If you look at the series of things, first all this lending, right? Then how many collapses have we had? ILFS, Punjab and Maharashtra Cooperative Bank, we had the Punjab National Bank, the Nirav Modi thing,
very serious,
series of things, and then now Diwan Housing. I mean, where was our regulatory apparatus? Why didn't we stop this? Right? And so that, there are no easy solutions for this, but going forward, we need to really, really strengthen this so that, these things don't keep recurring again.
And it affects foreign investors. Exactly. Two things people have told me, foreign investors, they don't come because of the pollution. They don't want their people won't. In fact, many embassies can't find people to come here. And the second thing they say, I don't want to come to India. There'll be false cases put against me. And, that's a terrible reflection of what's happening and why people don't want to invest.
Yeah, see, but Prannoy, remember that for about 2 decades now, we've had this problem of what I've called, the 4C problem, right? That public sector officials, honest ones, private sector people have this fear of the investigative agencies. The 4Cs I call, the courts, CBCs, CVC, CBI, CAG,
that's one you
the 4C. So I think that, we don't want to actually make that problem worse through, arbitrary, going after things.
I mean, there have to be checks, but then, as you say, innocent until proven guilty. The next point you make, again, a very important point, and it's quite controversial, shrink the public sector number of banks. In other words, privatize more banks, have more independence of banks from the government.
See, I've kind of lost faith in the sense that we could somehow, create independence for the public sector banks.
That's the problem.
We've said about this time and time. It's kind of my definition of, it's kind of Einstein's definition of insanity, right? You try and do the same thing again and again and think that things will be different. But I think here, I think, Prannoy, there are many things possible. One is, to privatize some banks. The other is to allow much more entry, allow more banks to come in, give licenses.
So the percentage of private sector banking will go up.
You could start, go back to a new model of DFIs, development financial institutions, which could maybe do the long-term project lending in a way that banks can't. So a number of, but this is more a kind of long-run thing.
Long-run thing, but it is a big worry that the public sector banks are under too much political pressure from any party, states, governments, whatever you want.
And the other side is we've forgotten that I think in the last 5 years, 3.5 lakh crores of taxpayer money has gone into the public sector banks. You know, yeah, in the last crores. So this is like sucking in taxpayer money.
Like Air India.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That is what it is, but on a much bigger scale.
Yeah. They're finding it tough enough to privatize Air India, but anyway, at least there are private airlines in India. And
that's the entry. That's like you're getting more private sector entry.
Exactly kind of parallel sort of thing. And finally, let's have a look at the next point on fixing the financial. Provide funding to only those banks who are reforming their systems and processes.
So I think that, you know, when government has been injecting money into the banks, firstly, a lot has gone on. But, you know, in a sense, all this money has gone in just to get these banks at prudent levels of, you know, lending and, you know, to have enough capital. But, you know, unless you get the reforms of these things along with the money, it's like back to business as usual. So that's the sense in which we've pumped in a lot of money. We had to, you know, whatever, do this.
But it was like across the board.
Yeah, it was pretty much across the board. But now we have to differentiate. We have to say, you know, those that get, do the reform, show, you know, that their underlying risk management procedures are better, you know, only those. And it's actually linking it to also shrinking the, you know, the bad public sector banks. You know.
Now, if we move on to another area which everybody says in real distress is our agricultural sector. And you actually spend a lot of time on that, and it's really enlightening stuff that you've written. Let's look at what Arvind Subramanian says on how to fix agriculture. Number one, main thing is direct cash to farmers. Direct. Don't give it through fertilizer companies and power companies so they get cheap fertilizer and cheap power. Just give them the cash direct. And I think you've got a statistic where farmer incomes are going down despite these subsidies to fertilizers and power. Yeah. Because they're not being passed on, I guess.
Well, I think that, you know, I think farm incomes have come down even though output has remained the same.
Yes.
Because prices, international prices have also come down.
Yes, also
but this is, you know, Prannoy, if you think about this, you know, fertilizer and power subsidies create so many, you know, adverse effects. Overuse, soil quality, environmental quality, health quality, and they're also fairly kind of, they go to disproportionately to the large farmers. So I think any long-run sustainable agriculture in India has to have this. But remember here the objective, you know, just to step back on agriculture, Prannoy, you see, the big point here is that we have to raise agricultural productivity. I think that should be the overarching objective here.
Right, that's the key. And also prices. And the next 2 points, if we take them because they're related and very important, and it doesn't seem that tough to do, create one all-India market for agricultural products. Yeah. That in itself, people have shown, will increase incomes by 20–25%.
See, the government has this ENAM, you know, platform which they started, but I think, you know, we need to improve that. It's not yet gone through.
And the second point is, you know, stop our constant flip-flop in agricultural trade policy. Sometimes you have high tariffs, sometimes low tariffs, goes all over the place.
Yeah, so this is a point that also Professor Ashok Gulati makes very strongly, right?
It's excellent.
That, you know, when prices go up, we impose controls, export controls and other controls. When prices go down, we impose tariffs. But essentially what happens is that you don't guarantee policy certainty to farmers. So the person who ends up getting hurt by this is the farmer because he doesn't know what prices he's ultimately going to get, and that uncertainty.
And I hate to say it as an agricultural economist, and my PhD was on that. One thing that does affect this is affecting cropping pattern. Yeah. The way we give MSP, minimum support price on wheat and rice, effectively, and many others we don't actually pay it. So people just, we are producing so much wheat and rice, and we're short on onions, short on pulses, short. So that needs to be, the cropping pattern needs to be.
And the subsidies are a very important part of that. I mean, after all, you know, the Delhi pollution problem, it has many components. But one part of it is, you know, Punjab shouldn't be growing so much rice.
Yeah, I mean, we've got millions and millions extra tons.
And they're growing rice because of the MSP and the power and water subsidies.
I think just cropping pattern, very good disincentives and incentives are really skewed up. Couple of other points. One very controversial. One is not controversial, and we need to know more. Incentives for water conservation, including drip irrigation, you mentioned. And the final one, and you'll lose 3/4 of...
Maybe you should put it up.
3/4 of the woke audience, because you're an OG, right?
Yeah.
You're an OG?
Yeah.
Right. These 2 words I learned today. So, yeah. Allow new GMO crops. Now, there's huge controversy about that, but often it's more emotional than based on facts, because there's nothing really been shown the direct connection between GMO and cancer or disease. Is that correct?
See, I don't want to get into the details of this, because it is a little bit controversial.
Yeah.
But I do think that if you think about the cotton revolution in Gujarat, for example.
That's all GMO.
It's all GMO, right? And you look at China, for example. I mean, I think Brazil, GMO in many of these things is taken off. So I think that we shouldn't have a knee-jerk thing against it. I think we should assess, have proper regulation, but to ex ante rule it out. Right. Because remember, the aim is to increase agricultural productivity.
The key point, I think, which you mentioned, is that give farmers GMO, let them grow GMO crops, their incomes will go up 3 times, they send their kids to school, their standard of living will go up. So let the farmers also decide on this, whether GMO or not. It will affect the lives of farmers.
No,
right?
But here, I think on agriculture, I think that the one big point we've made is that productivity, right? But the second point is this: none of this is new. None of this is new. Right. We've been saying this for 15, 20 years.
No, but
Professor
it's not beautifully focused, and you need
Professor
to just do it now.
Yeah, lots of Indian agricultural economists have said this is nothing. Right. It's not anything new that I'm saying.
They've also said 25 other things. So you've selected what you think are practical.
But here's the thing: the question is, why doesn't it get done?
That's what I'm going to end with. Ask you: A, why doesn't it get done? And B, for our average viewer, for me, it's very worrying. These statistics are terrifying. Should they get out of stock exchange, get out of real estate? Are things going to collapse? Are we heading for a slowdown to a collapse?
Yeah. So first on agriculture, just to finish this, part of the reason why things are not getting done is many of these policies are both determined by the center and by the states.
Right.
So we need the kind of GST type cooperative federalism framework to, I think, implement this. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to do that. But now let's come back and step back and say,
where the average viewer.
Yeah, for the average viewer.
What should they do after hearing this really worrying diagnosis?
Yeah. So I think the way I'd summarize it is I'd make 4 or 5 big points just to summarize. One, this is something very serious. It has structural components and short-term components,
but it's very serious.
It is, it's the Great Slowdown, and we shouldn't expect that things are somehow going to get automatically better. Okay. I do think that we should moderate our expectations about what long-run growth is going to be in India. Second, we do need
We're not entitled to 8-9% growth.
Exactly. So,
even with our figures.
Exactly, even with that. But I think that I don't like the kind of despair and determinism of saying somehow we're stuck in a trap and therefore,
No, but you've given remedies, but it's just got to be done.
Yeah, it's in our hands, we can do it. And
it's in our hands.
Yeah, it's in our hands, we can do it. And the other thing I would warn against is that, over the next few months, there is going to be good news. There is no doubt, because the economy, it's self-adjusting. But when the good news comes, we should not say, oh my God, problem solved. That the complacency that can set in, and therefore moderate expectations, warning against complacency, but above all, the challenge is we got into this for whatever reasons, we can get out of it through our own actions. And I think now, we can. So it's not a counsel of despair.
Right. Arvind Subramanian, that was just brilliant. And thank you very much for raising all these issues, because we've always said, everybody said, that India only reacts when it realizes it's in a crisis. And we are in the Great Slowdown, and we have to do something. And this is the time when India does do something. Thank you very much.
And I agree with that completely. Great to be on the show, Prannoy.
Thank you very much indeed.